Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. We have completed our first season as an expansion team in Major League Baseball. The Wings, as you can see, went 71 and 91, 21 games behind in the National League East, finished seventh, tied for seventh, which also means tied for last with the Philadelphia Phillies. The other expansion team this year, the Nashville Stars, did a bit better in the American League East, finishing 76 and 86. And we did finish the season on a bit of a high note, going 3-0 in our final three games of the year against the Pittsburgh Pirates. Won all three of those games, ended the Pirates' playoff hopes, and got ourselves over 70 victories on the season. So a pretty good finish to what was certainly an up and down year. Had only two winning months other than October. We were 14 and 12 in June, 15 and 14 in August. Season was really derailed by that 7 and 18 record in the month of July. 280 winning percentage. Clearly can't afford to have a lot of months like that if we're going to be a competitor down the line. We were actually 3 games below our Pythagorean expectations, so I guess that's a decent thing to latch on to, is maybe a reason for some small degree of optimism as we start preparing for the 2027 season. Had a winning record at home at Infield. We were pretty brutal on the road, though, 26 and 55, something that we need to fix. We were 1 game under 500 in one-run games, 3 and 5 in extra inning games. Game over 500 against lefties, and we struggled with a 418 winning percentage against right-handed pitching. Batting, the top things to talk about: we were 5th in the league in batting average, 6th in the league in hits, 5th in the league in strikeouts, and we were 2nd in base running. Other than that, though, we were generally in the bottom half, bottom third of the league in pretty much every other hitting category. Didn't finish last in anything in the 16-team NL. Our worst position was 15th in walks. The pitching stats, not generally as good. The best we were in anything was 9th in hits allowed. You can see 11th, 12th, 13th, 10th in most of the pitching categories. So certainly in the bottom half, bottom third of the league in just about every pitching category. 10th in defensive efficiency, but we were 3rd in zone rating. So we've got a lot of work to do this offseason. One thing you may have noticed at the financial summary screen, our budget, which got a nice boost to $180 million, is tied for 28th in baseball. I have a little bit of a fear here, and those of you who have played following some of the recent updates can let me know what you're experiencing. But it seems like with the latest patch to OOTP, they basically just put a lot more money into the leagues to address some of the financial issues. My fear, though, is that they've dumped so much money into the leagues that it's going to really result in a free agent market that's pretty brutal. And when we look at our upcoming free agents for this upcoming season, you can see that there's only a handful, 6, so I guess a little more than a handful, but 6 players who our scout thinks have 3.5-star potential or higher. Everybody else who's anticipated to be on the free agent market is kind of a 3-star player. There's a dozen and a half or so of them, and then there's a lot of kind of replacement level players on the free agent market. So I do worry that, and this may be me just reading way too much into it, but with the fact that it seems like there's a lot more money in the leagues right now following the latest patch, that just means teams have a lot of money to throw at their own players, and the free agent market may be pretty meager for the next few years. Hopefully, if that's happening, it will iron itself out over the next few seasons, but it certainly could mean that our opportunity to really jumpstart the Buffalo. I call them the Bills. The Wings as a potentially competitive team may take a little longer than we have hoped. We've got a good farm system at this point, ranked seventh or fifth out of 32 teams. Boy, I'm stumbling over every word I want to say. Maybe I should slow down and think before I'm talking here. But we've got a pretty solid farm system that we're building. We're coming off of a draft that I really liked in 2026 a few months ago. But if we can't kind of use some of this massive amount of money that we have available to really supplement our roster through free agency, it may take us a season or two longer than I had hoped to get this team competitive. Certainly coming off of a 71 and 91 season, we haven't even started the offseason yet because the playoffs are just beginning today. But my goal is to get this team to be about 500 next year. Would love to see a 10-game improvement in the standings, get this team to 500, and then hopefully the year after next we can be a team with a winning record and potentially even competing potentially for a wild card spot. But we're going to need to find some ways to productively spend this money rather than just showering it on players who aren't really worthy of contracts. So could be an interesting offseason for us. But before we get to that offseason, after reviewing the team statistics, let's take a dive and review our statistics of our top players. Tyler McGill is a guy who we kind of signed to be our number one starter. He started 36 games for us, as you can see, 11 and 16 record, 5.21 ERA, which was pretty rough. Led the National League in games started, and he provided 2 wins above replacement level when all was said and done. We have him signed at very team-friendly amounts for the next few years. Our plan when we signed him was to hopefully have him migrate from a first or second starter to a fourth or fifth starter over the term of that contract. And doesn't look like there's going to be any superstar starting pitchers available for us to focus on in free agency. But maybe we can come up with something in a trade and continue to hopefully be less and less reliant on Tyler as the next few years go by. Sean Sullivan, the lefty rookie guy who was our second-round draft pick in 2024, had a really nice rookie year, 11 and 11 record, 3.66 ERA. Now his Sierra was higher by 2/3 of a run compared to his ERA. His FIP minus was just average, but his ERA plus was still pretty solid. Quality start percentage not impressive at all, unfortunately. May have kind of performed a little better than his ratings would indicate, but certainly think that he'll be an important part of our rotation and a cheap part of our rotation for the next few years. Martin Perez is the guy who ended up starting the first game in Buffalo history, finished the year 12 and 16 with a 4.93 ERA, also threw a no-hitter for us, the first no-hitter obviously in Buffalo Wings history. He is a pending free agent, made the major league minimum this year because he had been a minor league signing of ours about a year and a half ago. Looking for only $2 million a year, so we could bring him back. I just don't know that a guy who's going to be 36 right around opening day, just don't know that he's the type of guy that we really need to bring back. And then Bryce Miller and Mike Burrows are guys who got into the rotation later on in the year. Bryce Miller, 28-year-old, certainly has a profile that he could be back in the rotation next year. 3-6, but a 3.44 ERA. Started the year in the bullpen where he was very effective. You can see he saved 24 games for us, and we did end up giving him a shot in the rotation where he was pretty solid. Similarly, Mike Burrows, another guy who started the year as a reliever for us, ended up starting 9 games over the summer and into the fall. 6-2 record on the year, 2.37 ERA. Certainly has a profile that I would expect him to be a important member of our pitching staff next season. Javier Atencio took over as closer when Miller moved into the rotation. The 24-year-old left-hander who we picked in the expansion draft had a pretty solid year for us. 76 strikeouts over 57 and a third innings pitched, 191 Sierra. His ERA plus and his FIP minus both really off the charts. Proved to be a pretty useful arm out of the bullpen. Happy to have him around. Mike Baumann, another reliever who had a pretty solid year for us. 2-2 record, 1 save, more than a strikeout an inning, 3.22 ERA. Sierra right in the same range. I think he'll be probably part of the team going forward. His arbitration number of $3.4 million next year, getting to be a little expensive for what he is. So that'll be an interesting decision when we do get to the offseason once the playoffs are done. Think he could certainly help our team, but we'll have to see what other options there might be available in free agency. Misael Tamares is a guy who started as a starter for us. You can see he ended up starting 22 games, moved him into the bullpen where he was somewhat more effective, finished the year with a 5-9 record, 4.32 ERA, well over a strikeout an inning, 11.5 strikeouts per 9 innings. Certainly has an impressive arsenal. Would prefer that he doesn't end up back in the rotation next year, but certainly think he could be an arm that could help us out of the bullpen. Max Meyer, a guy we picked in the Rule 5 draft, 1-4 record, 4.77 ERA. The profile and the fact that he's only going to be 28 next year suggests we probably keep him around, but would hope that his performance at the major league level improves next year. Yency Almonte is a guy we picked up in a trade with the Mets right before the trade deadline. They made an interesting offer to us, and he wasn't good when we brought him over. 5.24 ERA, 19 walks, and 5 home runs allowed in 34 and a third innings pitched. So definitely was not effective. We've got him signed next year for a pretty big number, $3.7 million. He's going to turn 33 next season. He could be a guy that we look to move on from this offseason if we can get someone to take that contract off of our hands. Colby White, 28-year-old reliever, was 2-4, 5.34 ERA, did strike out well over a batter an inning, 12.3 strikeouts per 9, and his Sierra was 2.62. BABIP was over 300. Hope that he can be better next year. His profile suggests that he could be. I think there's a fair chance that he'll be back with us next year. Brandon Williamson is a lefty long reliever, was solid, not great. 7-4 record, did strike out more than a batter an inning, walked a few too many people with 41 homers over 92 and 2/3 innings pitched, and the big issue was the 13 home runs allowed. He is a fly ball pitcher with average-ish movement, doesn't throw incredibly hard, so he's a guy that might not be a perfect fit for us. The one thing that he does have going for him, he's extremely popular locally, so that's certainly an incentive to keep him around and help us get more fans into the seats here in Buffalo. Humberto Rosado, 28-year-old right-hander, split the year between AAA Albany and the majors, was 2-0 with a 1 ERA over 18 innings pitched. Obviously a small sample size. He was a starter for us in Albany, moved into the pen once we brought him up, and pitched pretty well. Certainly would think that he potentially can be back with us next season. And last but not least, among the pitchers, Raylin Perez, Rule 5 draft pick, 25-year-old, 2-4 record, but a 2.82 ERA and nearly 11 strikeouts per 9 innings for us. Put up a 1.09 whip on the year. I think he certainly could be an important part of our bullpen going forward. So the key thing is going to be to add a starter or two to strengthen our rotation. I don't hate our bullpen, although when you factor in everybody and you look at our overall statistics, the bullpen ERA was not incredibly impressive either. But my thought is that if we add in another starter or two this offseason who can be better than most of the guys that we have, push the likes of McGill and Sullivan down to be third, fourth kind of starters, that lets us push some other guys into the bullpen, probably move some guys out of the bullpen to AAA or off of our team entirely, who are the more cuspy players, and hopefully when all is said and done, improve our starting rotation, improve our bullpen, improve the number of runs we allowed, and ultimately improve our record next year. So the key is going to be finding some starting pitchers. And as I mentioned, there isn't necessarily a lot of great options who look like they're going to be available. Kevin Gaussman, who's going to be looking for about $17 million a year, is a solid starting pitcher. 9-4 with a 3.58 ERA for the A's this year, but he's going to be turning 36 years old before next season begins. Can he give us a couple of solid years? I think he probably can, but I don't necessarily want to make a 5-year commitment to a player like that. We'll have to see what he's looking for if and when he does hit free agency. And he's also certainly not an ace. Some of the other guys that we could potentially go after, Chris Bassett, Matthew Boyd, probably going to try to avoid these guys with pretty poor movement on their pitches if at all possible. But Eric Lauer, Nick Martinez, Nance McCullers Jr., Casey Mize, James Paxton, Eduardo Rodriguez, Bryce Wilson, some of the other names that we could look to add. So not a ton of top-end talent is going to be available among the starting pitchers. I think we could add one or two of these guys who would give us respectable-ish major league fourth or fifth starter kind of performance. The issue is, of course, that they're probably going to be our first and second starter or second and third starter. And I don't think we're going to be able to make a big step forward with our pitching staff this offseason, particularly our starters through free agency. So we may have to be creative and perhaps try to leverage the good farm system that we do have to maybe bring over some starting talent through the trade market this upcoming offseason. But certainly improving our starting pitching is going to be a key goal of ours when the offseason does get going in earnest and free agency opens. Turning now to our everyday players. Israel Pineda is a guy who was our backup catcher this year. Certainly has a more than acceptable bat for a backup catcher. Would love it if his catcher ability was just a little bit higher. Hit .268 for us with 7 homers and 127 at-bats. 122 OPS plus, 123 WRC plus. Wouldn't necessarily expect that type of offensive production going forward. But for a Rule 5 draft pick, did a pretty good job. Still going to be making not too much money next year. So he is certainly in the mix to be a backup catcher for us next year. We do have one option year left. If we're able to improve the position and he ends up in the minors, we can stash him in AAA next season now that he has spent the entire year with us here with the Wings. And it's not inconceivable that Pineda ends up being our starter, even though we don't love him defensively, because Christian Vasquez is a guy we signed as a minor league free agent. He ended up making the roster and got a decent salary for us. Love the captain personality, love the excellent defense. And given his batting ratings, his offense was much better than I would have expected. Hit .266 for us, 6 homers and 444 at-bats. So kind of interesting that our backup catcher hit more home runs than our starting catcher did. The argument to bring Vasquez back is his leadership in the clubhouse and his excellent defensive ability. The argument against bringing him back is he's going to be turning 37 next year. Despite that great catcher ability, our pitching staff was not all that impressive this year. And perhaps most importantly, he's looking for 5 years at an average of over 14 million a year. Seems like an aggressive contract for us to consider giving to Vasquez at this stage of his career, even though, as I talked about, we've got tons of money to spend, but I just don't know that that would be the most prudent way to spend it. Nick York is a guy who was a utility infielder for us much of this year. Doesn't necessarily have a great spot defensively. First base is where he played a fair amount for us. Can play second in a pinch, can play left in a pinch. But the bat was solid. 292 average, 13 doubles and 9 homers and 281 at-bats. Certainly has an offensive profile that would indicate that the 24-year-old could be a bat coming off of our bench for the next few seasons. In contrast, Jacob Amaya is a little older, another guy that we picked up in the expansion draft, but the 28-year-old hit just a $173 and 98 at-bats as a utility infielder for us. Like the work ethic and the spark plug personality, like that he's a bit better defensively, but that bat just not really proving to be a major league bat so far, at least in his experience with us. He did okay with Toronto at the major league level in 2025, was pretty mediocre with Miami in 2024, and he is 28 years old now. Don't know whether he's going to be able to make the squad next season or not. Tommy Edman was our starting second baseman most of this year. Hit 242, 22 doubles, 10 homers, 657 OPS. So it was good for just an 82 OPS plus, 78 WRC plus. Did put up 2 wins plus above replacement. He's a pretty solid defensive player, a pretty versatile defensive infielder. We've got him signed for next year if we want at $6.8 million. We signed him very late in the spring training, so we were able to get him with a front-loaded contract with the money that we had to spend this past season. I don't know that he's a $6.8 million player at this point, but given his defensive versatility, given that he's got a little bit of speed, he can steal some bases. As you can see, he was 20 for 22 on the year. I think in a perfect world, we'd like him to be a veteran presence in the clubhouse and a utility infielder for us next year. That said, it's also conceivable that he ends up being a starter for us again next year. Tend to think he'll probably be back with us, even though the money that we're potentially going to be paying him is relatively big, given that there's so few options that look like they're going to be much better than him that will be available on the free agent market. I think we'll probably exercise the offer, keep him around, and maybe ultimately have him filling a Jacob Amaya kind of role next year as a utility infielder if we're able to improve at some of the other positions. Deshaun Seifu, the number 1 overall pick from this year's past draft, is a guy who had a meteoric rise through our system. We played him in rookie ball for a week, couple weeks in A ball, 2.5 weeks in high A, couple weeks in double A, couple weeks in triple A, and then we brought him up after Albany missed out on the playoffs just to get him a little more playing action. And I'm actually a little bit surprised. Everyone who has commented in the comments of previous episodes kind of thinks I'm crazy for having progressed him through the system so quickly. And I get it to some extent, and I tend to generally be pretty conservative with my minor leaguers, but I just wanted to get him as much playing time as possible. The point's been made ever since we took him out of Double-A. He hasn't hit incredibly. That's fair. I mean, a 220 average in Triple-A, 217 batting average in the major leagues. I can't argue with that comment because it's completely accurate, but his contact has moved up a bit already. If we take a look at his scouting report from back when, before we drafted him, thought he had 50 contact. He's up to 60 now. Still has the 80 potential there. His eye has improved 5 points. Still has the 50 potential there. We think his defense is a little better. So it doesn't seem like his development has really been curtailed by our perhaps bit aggressive use of him, but I just wanted to get him as much playing time as possible. And once the AAA season ended, the majors was the only way to do that. So the question is whether he will start in AAA or the majors for us next year. If we keep him down in AAA for a month and a half or so, even with the service time he has with us now, that would allow us to remanipulate his service time in a nefarious way to keep him under our control a little bit longer. So that's one option. Could be a situation where Tommy Edman starts the year as our second baseman, and then after a month, month and a half, 2 months, particularly if Seifu has developed a little bit more, we bring him up, and that allows us to move Edman into more of a utility role. While he was up with us, although Seifu hit just 217 and was a negative, slightly WAR player for us, was 7 for 8 stealing bases, and he was pretty successful across the minor leagues this year, given that blistering speed and excellent stealing and base running ability that he has. So my hope is he can develop as close to 80 and 80 in contact and gap power. If he does that with this type of speed, he's got the ability to hit well over 300 at the major league level, slapping around a lot of doubles and triples. Never going to hit for much home run power, but also should not strike out all that much. And the big concern with me is, can we get that eye, up another 5 or 10 points to 45 or 50? Would love it if he was able to draw a few more walks, especially at the major league level. He drew no walks in his 60 major league at-bats that he was up with us for. So definitely need to work on that eye, and that may be something if he starts the year down in AAA where he's able to improve a bit. Nolan Jones, a guy who played third and first for us, ended up getting more playing time in the second half of the year when we started moving on from Jose Abreu as a regular starter. Hit 265 with 14 homers and 373 at-bats. Has a captain personality. You look at his contract situation from the Rule 5 pick, and he's going to be a major league minimum player again next year. Tend to think he's going to be back with us and in the mix to be a first base / third base / utility infielder for us. Jordan Westberg should be back as our starting third baseman, a guy we picked in the expansion draft. 259, 22 homers, 35 doubles, 773 OPS on the year, 3.5 WAR. A respectable defensive third baseman, not anything more than that. But given where we are offensively and given his profile and what he did on the field this year, hard to imagine that he's not going to be an important player for us next year. And then last but not least, among the infielders, young shortstop Kevin Made, who we picked up in that trade with Detroit last offseason, hit 262, 29 doubles and 13 homers and 526 at-bats. A bit above average in terms of his OPS plus and his WRC plus. Not a perfect defensive shortstop with those ratings, but the best defensive shortstop we have who has a major league bat at this point. I think it's possible he migrates over to third base or maybe second base in the years to come. But right now he is certainly penciled back in at 24 years old as our likely starting shortstop for the upcoming 2027 season. Turning to our outfielders, Lloyd Del Chapelle, a guy who spent most of this year as our starting left fielder, did miss about 6 weeks near the end of the season. Hit close to 300, 295 batting average, 25 doubles, 16 homers, OPS plus and WRC plus both over 130 or higher. So a pretty productive offensive season. Nothing exceptional defensively, but is a left fielder. We can certainly live with that. He's a guy with 3 option years left. He's a guy who made his major league debut with us this year, going to be making the major league minimum next year. I think in a perfect scenario, we'd love him to move towards more of a 4th or 5th outfielder role over the next couple of seasons, but likely to be a starter for us in left field again next year. Eloy Jimenez, minor league free agent signing who ended up making the major league roster for us. 230 average, but did have 21 doubles, 21 homers for us. Quite honestly, though, the OPS below 700, little disappointing for a player of his experience. Pretty much just has the home run power at this point. Otherwise, a pretty average-ish batting profile. Doesn't bring much to the table defensively. He's going to be a free agent after this year, and the number is not horrible at around $6 million a year for 4 years. We could probably get him for a little less than that. He's going to be 30 years old, though, in about a month and a half. Obviously, he'll be 30 when next season starts. Based on his production over the last few seasons, he's not that much better than a replacement level player at this point, despite those Silver Slugger awards in 2020 and 2023. Still has that home run power, but otherwise, I don't know. I kind of see him as a potential 4th or 5th outfielder for us next year. $6 million a year seems high for that. But again, we've got lots of money to spend, and there aren't necessarily going to be tons of great options to spend it on, which we talked about with Edman already, and could end up in the case of Jimenez, meaning that when we look at what the prospective market looks like for free agents that we could add, we may end up bringing back Jimenez and exercising our option year on Edman, just even if eventually those guys move from starting roles into backup roles at some point next year. We've got the money to spend, and they still may be better than the alternatives. Eric Pena, another guy that we picked in the expansion draft, split the year between AA Utica, AAA Albany, and then we did bring him up to Buffalo at the end of the year. Hit 247, 743 OPS. Don't hate the batting profile. Defensively, he's okay in the outfield. I mean, being able to give more playing time to a young guy like Pena making the major league minimum is kind of the argument to move on from Eloy Jimenez, because if he's on the team, that's likely taking at-bats from Pena, and you could certainly argue that with the exception of the home run power, Pena's overall batting profile, you could argue, is better with the exception of the home run power than Jimenez is. He's obviously about 6.5 years younger, slightly better defensively, and certainly more cost effective. Jose Siri was our center fielder, guy we picked in the Rule 5 draft. Love his defense, love his speed. Was successful on 18 of 22 stolen base attempts. Hit just 232 this year. The batting profile doesn't suggest that we can hope for much better than he did this year offensively. Right now, he's by far the best defensive center field in our system. Would think that he's going to be back with us next year. The arbitration estimate is $2.5 million-ish. Tend to think we'll probably bring him back unless we're able to make some unexpectedly big move in the offseason. He'll probably be back as our starting center fielder because of the glove. And then last but not least, Jace Barofin, who was the first round draft pick ever in the history of the Buffalo organization back in 2023, had a more than respectable rookie year, quite honestly. 255 batting average, 40 doubles, 24 homers, 88 ribbies, team leading numbers for all of those. Ended up with a 111 OPS plus, 109 WRC plus, and a 2.5 WAR. He is a competent defensive outfielder, spark plug personality, good work ethic, and certainly a little room to still improve, at least according to our scout, in terms of his contact and his gap power. So, could argue that he can be a little better than this offensively. Played 156 games for us, generally was batting right in the middle of the lineup, typically 3rd or 4th for us, and certainly see that type of role for Barofin next year as well. So he is one guy that it's hard for me to imagine a scenario where he's not playing right field or left field for us next year and batting somewhere in the middle of our order. And a couple other guys who are going to be in the mix for roster spots next year that I did want to mention. Luis Durango is a guy who split the year between AAA and the majors. Hit 271 with 25 homers in AAA. Hit 250 in very limited action for us at the major league level, and we had some injuries. Pretty pedestrian and average batting ratings. Has a little bit of speed. Doesn't look horrible defensively. Honestly, when I think about our team, probably makes sense to move on from Jimenez. Barofin's obviously going to be back. Chappelli is obviously going to be back. Siri, given his defensive skill in center field, it's hard to envision us having a better scenario than that for center field next year. And with guys like Pena and Durango to potentially be backup corner outfielders for us, maybe spending $6 million on Jimenez, even if we have the money, doesn't make a ton of sense. We've got time to figure these things out. Petey Halpin, another guy that we picked in the expansion draft, hit just 246 in AAA for us this year. Another guy who could be in the mix as a backup outfielder. Vance Honeycutt could be a little more interesting. This is a guy who we picked in the 8th round in 2024. Split this year between high A ball, where he hit 316 with 22 homers. We promoted him to Double A Utica, where he hit 260 with 15 homers and just 127 at-bats. And then I finished off the year spending a few weeks in AAA, hit just a $192, only 1 homer and 73 at-bats. So certainly doesn't seem like he's ready for the majors yet, but again has another batting profile that suggests he's probably a more cost-effective and not completely dissimilar version of Eloy Jimenez. So we've got some options there. One other guy that I wanted to mention was Brady House, who split the year between AAA and the majors. Hit 293 with 39 homers in AAA after we picked him in the expansion draft. 250 in a relatively limited sample size, 1 homer and 32 at-bats at the major league level. Another guy who's going to be in the mix to be a corner infielder or perhaps utility infielder for us next year with at least a little bit of home run power, although probably going to strike out a lot between AAA and the majors this year. He struck out 141 times. So in the mix for a roster spot next year. So that's kind of a summary of the batters and the position players we have. Taking a look at the upcoming free agents. Salvador Perez, 36 years old, gives us a captain personality. That home run power is enticing. Otherwise, the batting profile doesn't necessarily look all that much better than Christian Vasquez's does. But certainly a player with that home run power that we think is probably going to be a better offensive player next year than Vasquez will be. Not quite as good defensively, but if we've got money to spend and Sal Perez is not looking for a real long contract, he could be a potential replacement for Christian Vasquez. Yandy Diaz, I think it depends on how much money he's looking for. In an ideal world, I'd like a first baseman to have a little bit more pop in the bat. That said, with that good contact rating, that good eye, he gets on base, and that's certainly a skill that we could use more of. Also a guy who's not going to strike out. Again, these guys in their mid-30s aren't going to be long-term members of this Buffalo club, but if we can sign them to a 1 or 2 year contract or maybe a slightly longer contract with some team options in there, it may be a way to spend some of the money that we have available this offseason. But just going through the profiles of the players that are available at a very high level, there's not any big time players here. Fran Reyes could definitely give us a big bat in the outfield, at least in terms of the home run power. Led the AL with 46 this year, hit 297. Certainly do not expect, given his profile, that he's going to be a 297 hitter. I think that number is probably closer to the 231 he hit a season ago, and hopefully at least it remains above the buck 91 he hit in 2024. But certainly has the opportunity to hit for some power. Again, he's a 31-year-old guy. Is he, a huge improvement for us in the outfield? Probably not. So we've got some interesting decisions to make. Kyle Schwarber and Miguel Sano, love the power that both of those guys have, but the contact is a bit of a concern. Schwarber, he's going to walk and he's going to hit home runs, and he's also going to strike out an insane amount of times, 200 strikeouts, 2 of the last 3 seasons at the major league level. Probably would have had him in 2025 if he hadn't not been playing every day and spent a little bit of time in AAA. So no obvious franchise-altering players for us to chase after in free agency this year, either in terms of the batters or in terms of the pitchers. A few interesting-ish relievers are, some of the higher-rated players out there. Certainly, you look at the profiles of an Evan Phillips or a Jalen Beeks, and they could certainly help our bullpen. But the area that we really need the help is in our starting pitching staff. Shane Bieber is listed as a reliever. He could be a starter for us, maybe a 5-inning guy, depending on the money he's looking for. That could be an option for us to bolster our starting pitching staff a bit, along with somebody like Gaussman. So there's no obvious, easy, slam dunk solutions for us as we're thinking about how we're going to spend the $60-ish million that we're potentially going to have available in this offseason. But seems like starting pitcher, starting catcher, and maybe a big bat for a corner outfield or a first base or a DH kind of slot would be areas where we could look to add some talent in free agency. And clearly we could look to add similar talent in the trade market. And there's really no position that we can't upgrade. As much as I love Jace Barofin and Kevin Made and Jordan Westberg and what I think Deshaun Seifu is going to become, none of those guys are irreplaceable either. And we could pivot any of them to another position, or if we get the team good enough, pivot any of them to more of a backup role than a starting role if the right opportunities are out there. As I said, when I look at free agency, I'd be very surprised if those 4 guys aren't all playing very significant roles for the Wings next year, with Westberg, Made, and Barofin almost certainly starters on opening day. Seifu, the question is just how long till he's going to be an everyday player for us. Is it on opening day, or is it a month, 2 months, 3 months into next season that we really turn the reins at second base or third base over to Deshaun Seifu? So if we can improve any of those guys, great. It just doesn't seem like there's going to be obvious solutions in the free agent market, which means that maybe I need to get creative in the trade market, get creative in the Rule 5 draft, and it'll be an interesting offseason, that's for sure. But before we move on to the offseason, we've got to find out who the 2026 World Champions are going to be. The Yankees, the Astros, the Padres, and the Braves were the 4 division winners in the expanded 8-team AL East, AL West, NL East, and NL West this year. And the division winners are the only teams that earn byes in the new playoff structure. Still 6 total playoff teams, but all of these teams are wild cards, with there only being 2 divisions in each league. And we've got a Yankees and Brave World Series here in 2026, so reminiscent of the mid to late 90s. The Yankees have gone 7-0 in the playoffs thus far, taken out the Guardians and the Orioles. The Braves took out the Cardinals 3 out of 4 and won 4 out of 6 against the Nationals. So the only 100-win team in baseball, the Yankees, will be looking to win the title against the Atlanta Braves. And unfortunately for the Yankees, they ran into the buzzsaw that was the Atlanta Braves. And the Braves are your 2026 World Series champions. And we've made it to the offseason. Obviously need to do an option year decision on Tommy Edman. Given the amount of money we have to spend and the mediocre free agent class, we are going to go ahead and execute that option. As we talked about, it's conceivable that if Deshaun Seifu ends up being what we hope he can be, that Edman will be moved into utility role by the second half of next season. But at this point, he's probably penciled in as our starting second baseman. Going to have to start thinking about arbitration, the offseason. Top prospects in baseball. Looks like we no longer have any top 10 prospects, with the fact that the catcher that we picked in the international amateur free agency, Andres Medina, a few years ago, has not been developing as we would have hoped. We'll take a look at what our minor league system looks like more broadly shortly. Hitting coach Joseph Hartline retired in Double-A, so we've got at least one replacement that we need to make for the minors. And let's find out the news on our budget. Ooh, we got a boost, boosted up to $206 million. So that's going to allow us a really decent payroll next year. That puts us 22nd in baseball, so much better than I would have expected. The issue is that we just aren't necessarily going to have great options to spend that on in free agency. We may know a little bit more at this point as far as upcoming free agents. And it does look like there's a couple new names. Luis Robert, center field, that would certainly be one potential option. You know, don't love that he's fragile physically, but certainly a better bat than we've got out there right now, with still some competent defense in center field. Jeff McNeil, another guy with a interesting bat coming off of a torn groin. Could see him playing a corner outfield spot for us. Looks like Jake Cronenworth, Manuel Margot, Josh Naylor, Alex Verdugo. I think most of those guys are new names as potential batters hitting free agents. So maybe a little more talent than we thought. Josh Bell, Nick Castellanos, Michael Conforto. There's some names at least for us to look at. Would love it if there were some more interesting pitchers available. And there is one. Shohei Ohtani, and for those of you, I think I know I've definitely mentioned this in the comments in previous episodes, and I think I also mentioned it in the episode when we did when I went through the settings. But I have the league set up to not allow two-way players, so Ohtani is just a starting pitcher. But he's coming off a year when he was 12-9 with a 2.81 ERA for the Cubs. That would be the type of guy who could make a real difference as we're looking for help in our starting rotation. Whether he will actually make it to free agency or the Cubs will sign him over the next couple of weeks before he hits the open market, who knows. But certainly it looks like, at least at a high level, there's a couple options that may be out there, notably Otani, Luis Robert, Brian Abreu, Hader, Heaney, McNeil, Sandy Alcantara. There's some more interesting options, and again, we're still 2+ weeks away from the start of free agency. Actually, over 3 weeks away from the start of free agency and free agency filing. So certainly an opportunity for some of these guys to end up signing with their teams before they hit the open market. But I do feel a little better that at least there may be some more high-ish end talent that we can potentially think about bringing on board in this offseason to kind of supercharge. I won't call it a rebuild. It's just a build of the Buffalo Wings. And as I said earlier in the episode, would like to get this team closer to 500 next year. And if we can add a big free agent or two in the offseason, that will certainly increase our chances of getting there. So it definitely seems like it's going to be an interesting offseason for our Buffalo Wings. We'll start tackling the decisions around arbitration in our next episode and start preparing for potential free agency. Looking at salary arbitration, not a ton of players with the exception of Jose Siri. It's all basically relief pitchers, although Burrows and Miller, as we talked about, did spend a little time starting. But the numbers on some of those guys are getting up there a bit. Jimenez, Perez, and Vasquez all headed to free agency. Don't think we will be submitting qualifying offers to any of them because pretty confident that they would all accept. I guess there is an argument with the amount of money that we have available. We don't want to sign Christian Vasquez to the 5-year, $14-ish million a season contract that he's looking for. But do we submit a qualifying offer to him, hope that he doesn't accept it so we get some draft compensation when he signs somewhere else? But if we have to pay him $19 million to be a really good defensive catcher for us for just one more year, given the amount of money we have to spend, that may be something to think about. I don't think it's something that we do right away. I think it's more we see what happens over the next 2.5-3 weeks until we get close to the free agency filings. And if we get to the free agency filings and, Otani, Robert, Abreu, McNeil, Alcantara, etc. are all still out there, maybe we don't submit the qualifying offer to Vasquez thinking that we'd like to kind of put most of our money in some of those other players. But if a few of these guys are off the market, maybe that's the best way for us to potentially spend that money. Again, I don't know that we want him to accept it, but we've got enough cash that if he does accept it, it's not the end of the world for us. And it does probably give us the best defensive option we've got available as a catcher next season for the Wings. So a lot of decisions that we're going to need to be making in the upcoming weeks, and we will start tackling those decisions in our next episode. If you've got thoughts on what we should try to do, would love to hear about them in the comments. And until our next episode, thanks so much for watching and hope you have a great day.